I hope if you haven't yet read the BRC report, you are in for a real treat because it is absolutely fascinating to read what is frankly just common sense when it comes to good board governance. We're going to start with some opening remarks, first from Wayne and then from Jane, that really relate to first the most recent report, and then Jane will talk about the earlier report that also deals with trust matters. So over to you.
Well, great, Steve. Thank you very much. It's great to be here in Houston today. I live in San Antonio, so I love Texas, and it's great to be in the big city of Houston. I thought I'd spend just a couple of minutes overview on the report and give you a sense of kind of the what, the how, and the why behind this year's report. I'll maybe echo Steve's comments. Please read the report. I think it's organized in a way that it can be very useful and helpful, not necessarily cover to cover all the time, but the ability to dive into different topics and get a lot of practical know-how from the report. You know, every year for about 23 years, the NACD has been publishing research reports of this ilk. I have the honor this year with Donna Young to be the co-chairs of this report. And I think what's most important that I'd want to share is that many times these reports have focused on the board, the role of the board, issues around the board from culture, et cetera. Jane will get into some of that history. But this year, the NACD really wanted to address and study a bit the relationship between the CEO and the board, and actually bring both of those constituents into the contents of the report. And so when you read this, you'll see that we're not only addressing the board, but also addressing kind of how-tos for the CEO. I think one of the really important aspects of this year's report, as Steve said, there's a lot of common sense information in there, but there's also a lot of how to get things done or how to use the principles in the right context in your company as well. And we felt like that was one of the big distinctions this year, was to really focus. Don and I were very purposeful to focus on the how to actually build trust. The theme this year was really the role that trust can play to enable CEOs and boards to be able to address the challenging environment that we're in, both in terms of the downside we may be facing or the crises that may come our way on any literally given day, but also to prepare boards to take advantage of the tremendous opportunity that lives in the uncertainty. And so you'll see that the report really addresses trust throughout as its kind of foundational thesis. And we broke the report up into three big pieces. One was establishing a foundation of trust. The second was actually operationalizing trust. And then the third is really where we said the magic happens, which is to be able to leverage a highly trustful environment to take full advantage of the board as a strategic advisor for CEOs. The report then breaks down those three themes into components. So you'll see that there are kind of 9 topics that are aligned to those three themes. And then in the back, there are 12 toolkits that we worked through, which are really the byproduct of best practices from the commissioners who participated in this report and other research the NACD has done. And I think that's where the real meat is in this report, that allows you to go deep and say, hey, these things may not be perfect for our environment, but these are a good starting place for me to adapt, adopt, or adjust in the context of my board, my company, and where we are in our evolution and market conditions. So that's a quick overview, Steve, of what we did and where we are today.
Thank you. Jane.
So as Steve mentioned, I had the privilege of working on both the 2023 Blue Ribbon Commission report, which was on the functioning of the board itself, and really arose from the very rapid refreshment that boards were doing at the time. So there were a lot of new people on boards. Boards were trying to deal with that, and the Blue Ribbon Report tries to strengthen the relationships of the board. So that was 2023. The bookend to that, the 2025 report, says now that we've strengthened the board relationship, let's take a look at the most important relationship that there is, which is between the board and the CEO, and let's try to strengthen that. So Wayne's done a great job in kind of profiling through what the BRC report for 2025 says. It's so inherently important now because of the speed and rapidity of change. Those of you from Austin are dealing with fast growth companies. Those of you in Houston are dealing with regulatory risk, commodity price risk, et cetera. So having everybody on the same page matters greatly in this kind of environment. The board also kind of makes a distinction or combines trust and oversight. And what I would say is a lot of people think that that is a binary choice. You either provide oversight or you're trustworthy. And I think that's a really false binary. And so what I would say is trust without oversight is complacency, and oversight without trust is surveillance. So Wayne mentioned the toolkit, and you're all going to get a copy of the report, and you've got the QR code and everything. But one of the questions in the toolkit is deceptively simple. It is, do your questions in the boardroom signal engagement or interrogation? So kind of the underpinning of trust is, are you framing it from curiosity and wanting to know, or from a gotcha perspective? So before we go any further, we thought it would be fun to do some interactive things on this board, so I'd ask you to all please make your hands available. So the first question I have for you is, how many of you sit on boards that have had at least one new board member in the last 5 years? Excellent. Please keep your hands up. Yes, you can put 2 hands up if you want. How many of you, show of hands, or you can put your hand down if it's not you, in how many of those situations did your board explicitly frame not just how you were going to onboard the new director, but how the board itself was going to adapt and change to accommodate the new director? So we're great at bringing talent onto the board, and Russell Reynolds and others are really good at helping us with that. We're not so great at integrating that talent once we have it. So if you think about sports, when you change the players on the field, you can't expect yesterday's playbook to run the same way. So that kind of underpins philosophically where we're going to go in this discussion.
Yeah, and Jane, just maybe to add a point here, one of the, I think, big ahas when you read this report is that there's not anything like radically new where you said, gee, I've never thought of that. But if you look at Jane's exercise a couple of moments ago, everyone knows probably what needs to be done, but we're not practicing with intention. And that's what the report more broadly, and then the toolkits are meant to do, is to help provide practices around the accountability of good hygiene to build trust across a broad spectrum of activities.
One of the, well, this report is extraordinarily timely. For those of you who are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, it measures trust across every aspect of society. And not surprising, if you wake up every morning and read the newspaper, trust is at an all-time low across all aspects of society. Business, government, our own families. The first, you talked about there's not an aha. There was an aha for me. When you read the first, almost the first statistic, when you read this report, it will tell you that only 37% of the CEOs questioned in this report, only 37% of the CEOs believe that the boards have their back. Can you imagine being a football player and going onto the field and only 37% of the football players think that their coaches have their back? Or your soldiers thinking that only 37% of the generals have their back? So if that is indeed correct, or even if it's only 50%, directionally, when you were CEO, how would that feel if you felt that if you didn't feel that the board had your back?
Well, Steve, let me just say what's also true is that if you survey board members, they also believe that they don't have the CEO's back, to a lesser degree than CEOs believe. So I think both boards and CEOs are raising this issue that there is a gap in trust and then a gap in perception between the CEO and boards more broadly. I would not have been happy if I didn't feel like the board had my back. But what I also recognize is that it was something I had to do to build on an ongoing basis. When I became CEO, literally the 1st of February of 2020, so if you guys can think back to what was happening that time, I think the stock market peaked on the 19th of February, and the 1st of March, the pandemic was becoming a reality. But one of the first things I wanted to do was actually to go and break bread with every one of my directors where they live and understand what are their issues and concerns. What am I planning to do as the CEO, and truly build a different relationship than maybe I had as a C-suite member, before coming in. And so I think no one would say, yes, I like the fact that I don't have a trusting board, but doing the work to actually build those strong relationships matters a lot. And then what I would say, Steve, is the transparency that follows, because one of the great things I heard was give us the good, the bad, and the ugly on a very regular basis. That transparency then reinforces back to what Jane was talking about, not just we are building intimacy in our relationship, but you can count on me to tell it to you straight about what's going on in the company.
Yeah, I'd actually like to double click on that if I can. So if everybody could again take your hands out. How many people in this room are former or acting CEOs? Thank you, Wayne. Keep your hands up, please. So everybody else in the room, just take a look around. When we talk, and you can put your hands down, thank you. When we talk about the board-CEO relationship, it's not the board talking about the CEO. It is the board talking with the CEO and acknowledging that how things look from the CEO's perspective may be different from how they look from the board's perspective. And if you don't get this right, bad news doesn't travel neutrally. So what you really want on a board is the ability, we all understand that once something gets in the board portal, it has been revised, perhaps intentionally, perhaps defensively, by many, many layers of management up there. So you're not necessarily getting the unvarnished picture of what's going on. You're getting the picture of what the management team wants you to see. If you don't have the trust underpinning that, it becomes very difficult to create that kind of environment, the good, the bad, the ugly, that Wayne was talking about. So this stuff is really, really essential. The perspective that you have when you're in the board, whether you are a collaborator, whether your questions are geared toward prosecution of the idea that's come up or curiosity to enable you to get below the facts that are established to you is critically important, particularly in terms of the challenges that we have in this environment.
But Jane, I think this is a really good example of if you've built that trusting relationship, when the bad and the ugly need to show up, you have the courage to deliver it. But when you deliver it, there's also a perspective from the board that we're going to presume best intent, and we're actually willing to roll up our sleeves and solve a problem as opposed to being prosecutorial when that bad news comes forward. And maybe that's a really good example of, does it really matter that you should spend time building trust? The answer is yes, because in times like these, you can trade on it in a very
It's like a
positive
bank.
way.
You want to make your deposits so you have it when you need it. What Wayne was saying, another way to frame that is in boards where the CEO is worried about blame or bad reaction or jumping to conclusion or being held personally for things that are perhaps beyond their control, a lot of stuff like that going on right now, the risks don't disappear. They get smoothed away. They get understated. And that's not good for really anybody. So not having that kind of environment, and again, the BRC toolkit has a lot of ways to approach framing of questions, to approach really attitude and perspective, particularly with the difficult situations, in order to get the best out of the board for the shareholders, for the company, and for the senior management team.
Jane, we keep talking about the board, but we all know that the board is really not the board. It's the board members. It's a group of individuals who've joined at different times, as we were just alluding to a few minutes ago. And they've often joined with very different objectives. You may have activist representatives who've joined under different CEOs. You may have board members who may have wanted a different CEO in the position. So they really aren't a single board. How do you build trust knowing that they have different objectives, different agendas in some cases?
So I think that's a great point. And you know, every report has its things that we could amend if we did it a second time. Mine would be talking about the board is not a monolith, because the board is made up of individuals with their own histories, their own experiences, their own perspectives, and perhaps, you know, their own hammers to bang on the CEO with. So you have to take all of that in context. One of the things that we talked about and really thought about was board leadership, being in the chair or the lead director. And oftentimes, we see that position being given to the person with the most tenure or the most authority, only to come to find that the CEO is guarded when talking with that person, that there's not a level of trust there. So a couple of things that I would say is every CEO should have the ability, the foresight, and the, you know, unspoken permission of the board to use each and every board member to their greatest level. So whatever, every relationship can be different, and trust. I think trust, really, to say the CEO trusts the board, trust is an individual thing. So what you want to do, and I'm going to ask Wayne to opine on this, is you build that trust. What he did with breaking bread with people in their hometowns, you build the trust individually, and then hopefully it collectivizes into a trust for the board. And sometimes it doesn't, right? So you want to have somebody on the board that the CEO can trust. It's not necessarily the lead director or the chairman or the longest serving board member or the guy that went to college with the CEO. Sometimes it's somebody different that just has a different perspective, a different mannerism, a different way of approaching the CEO. And what I would say is you can't audition for that, right? It happens organically. We would like to process everything and say this is how we need to behave and this is how trust needs to happen. It just doesn't happen that way. But each and every one of us is charged as a board member of understanding where that trust lays. And if it's not with you or with the lead director or with the chairman, to not be defensive about that, to be grateful that the CEO has somebody on the board that they can trust, and that person can come to the board and, you know, inform of difficult decisions. So it's not, it's individual. Hopefully it becomes collective, but it can also be asymmetrical, and all of that is very human and very humane, and it's perfectly okay.
Yeah, and Jane, what I would maybe add to this is we spend a lot of time in the report around the role of the lead independent director or the chair, both as a coach, mentor, liaison with the CEO, but also in their role of herding the cats or collaborating across the full board as well. To Jane's point, that person may not always be the best person to be in the role. I'll come back to that in a second, but they're in that role. And so building the right routines and hygiene between the CEO and the chair are vitally important, so that the CEO knows, I've got someone who can carry water for me if necessary, whether it's in an executive session or offline with key board members, almost a teammate. But it also gives that chairman or lead independent director a deeper sense of what's going on in the organization, so they can almost represent to other board members what's going on, not because they read it in a report, but because they've spent that level of time with the CEO. And then I think to your point about is it the right person or not, we spend a lot of time thinking about where the company is going and what type of CEO we need for this season of the company. We need to do the same for the chairman as well. And then for the chemistry between the chair/lead independent director and the CEO, and be much more intentional about if we've got a brand new CEO, who do we need to match them up with for where the company might be today. Because if you get that chemistry right, then maybe you don't have some of the challenges that you were describing. But if you do have them, then I think like most things in life, you find the people that you can relate to, and you relate to them in a very authentic manner.
Yeah, and again, I think, show of hands, how many of you are on boards where that trust relationship, that primary trust relationship, does not reside with the CEO or the lead director? It resides with somebody else. So it happens. It should be acknowledged, it should be celebrated that there is that relationship. If we could just take a beat, Stephen, on talking about what builds trust, and this again, because I just said, let's get away from process and talk about people, so let's get back to process. It's my happy place. So trust is built on predictability and follow through, not on grand gestures. So you really have to pay attention to things like decision rights. What decisions does the board make? What decisions does the CEO make? What decisions does the CEO inform? And what decisions does the CEO want to have a vote on? And so keeping those aisles clear, where it's important not just for the CEO and the board relationship, but for the senior management team as well, to see what is happening, to see how decisions are made, and to see what those decision rights are, and to be very consistent about that. It doesn't mean you don't collaborate, you don't challenge, you don't do that oversight, but understand what the what the regulations are, and stick by them, because once you start to blur those, trust goes away.
Yeah, so maybe we'll come back to the report and say building a strong foundation of trust was that first theme. And one of the first elements in the report is exactly what Jane is talking about here of whether it's process-wise with the delegation of authority document. So maybe we should do a raise of hands of how many folks have redone their delegation of authority document in the last year. All right, and then keep your hands up. How many folks have actually sat down and had a conversation between the CEO and the board about what we mean by the elements that are in the delegation of authority document? Right? So there too is, it's written on a piece of paper, probably on a shelf somewhere in your archives, but is it a living document, and does everyone truly understand what we mean? Because that delegation of authority set of rules or guidelines can create misalignment, can create erosion of trust, as we've seen so many times, simply because not everyone might understand what the rules of the road might be.
And just to add to that, bad process can undo good intent immediately. So I'd just like to give an example. I was on a board that was not a well-functioning board. There was a lot of dysfunction. At the very end of a very long and fractious meeting, the CEO, we were at a U-shaped table, and the CEO and the lead director were seated next to each other at the short end, and all the board members across. The lead director said, "We haven't done our board evaluations yet, so we're going to go around the table, and can everybody tell what they think about everybody else?" So, of course, it was really awkward, and nobody spoke. And it was an opportunity that could have been used to build trust, and it just destroyed trust even more, because the conversation going out of the room is, "Can you believe that just happened?" Like, what were they thinking? So it was it was an example where the lead director was check the box and not really thinking through, how do we create a culture? How do we surface if there is disagreement between and among board members. And, you know, we were talking at dinner last night, it's endemic. A lot of us are on boards with people with very different views, very different opinions on things, and our charter is to work together well despite all that. So that takes work, that takes understanding, and if we undermine that, we're undermining our own and our board's fiduciary responsibility. As hard as it is one of the things that we need to do, and we need to do well.
Yeah, Jane, I would come back to the report and say there's a section and a toolkit around kind of board performance evaluations, and maybe one thing to just add, you know, that maybe Jane's example isn't the best. You know, once you do go through a structured process, the closing the loop feedback is vitally important, and done in a structured way and in a kind of, you know, thoughtful and candid way, you know, are vitally important, because if we come back to a few other stats that are out there, you know, most board members feel like many board members feel like there's at least one board member who shouldn't be on the board. The majority of CEOs and C-suite members believe there's either one or two members on the board who shouldn't be there. And the fact that we are not going through appropriate board performance reviews is a condition that exacerbates this challenge, that maybe the board is not, you know, best composed for the challenges the company may be facing.
If you lose trust, if that trust is broken, is it realistic to expect that it can be rebuilt?
I think the answer to that, in my view, is it depends. And I think, you know, we probably all have...
what would be the steps that you could go
we all have great examples, right, of, okay, we had a disruption, we had a disagreement, we had misalignment, we had a blow-up, whatever you want to call it, that happened either in the boardroom or outside of the boardroom. So how do we get cooler heads to step back and go, okay, what happened and why, right? And then go through some level of mediation process to understand how we might be able to bring the parties back together again. And there are opportunities to do that, and there are situations where it works, and then there are situations where it just doesn't work, kind of like relationships in life. And then I think you have to get to the place where change needs to be made, and that needs to be done in a thoughtful, graceful, and, you know, timely fashion. But trust can be repaired, but I would say it's very difficult, especially when it becomes personal or emotional with folks.
In a situation I was involved with, we had board members that just didn't get along, and that manifested in the boardroom with pettiness, which if you take me out for a drink, I can tell you about, but not important for the story. What we did was we put those two board members together and had them work on a project together and report back to the board. So we forced them into a situation where they were either going to make it or break it, and then we could get to the second point of Wayne's decision and say, it's irrevocably broken, we've got to make a change here, or more hopefully, because each of those individuals had the skill sets, you know, everything worked out for what we needed, and they went through the project together beautifully. It was hard after that to get them to not sit next to each other in the boardroom and to, you know, be part of the board again. But there are things that you can do if you're intentional and meaning, you know, and really work with the best intentions. So you have to come from a place of, are these board members trying to sabotage everybody? Like, is that their role here? Or do they really want to get the work done that we need to get done? So there are techniques that you can use, but yes. And I would also, you know, bring it back, as the report does, to the trust between the board and the CEO. And again, looking at disclosure of bad news that may be beyond the CEO's immediate control to handle. So lots of that coming out at us now, whether it's, you know, tariffs, Greenland, whatever. Stuff is happening with supply chains. Not all of it is within somebody's control. So does the board take a really prosecutorial view of that and go to demand, what are you going to do, what's going to happen? Or is it more questioning, how does this change our plans? What does good look like in a bad environment? How can we help you think through this best? And you can see just from the framing, nobody's comfortable with what's happening. But one framing is geared toward getting responses that are constructive and collaborative, and the other is really dangerous. So I flew down from New York. It was a really turbulent flight in a very small plane. And I thought, the pilot isn't responsible for the weather, but he is responsible for letting us know when the turbulence is coming. And I kind of think about that, about the CEO relationship either. They're not responsible for all the weather, but they are responsible for knowing it's out there and letting us know about it.
And Jane, I think there's an ad here, which is getting ahead of the game. We're never going to predict everything that could happen, right? But building a quality risk framework and walking the board through the potential risks that could occur, or scenario plans that say, if these do happen, here's what we keep, here's what we don't keep, actually starts the process before there's a crisis, so that when a crisis happens, it may not be exactly what we thought it was going to be, but we've worked the board through a framework of how we will address and deal with uncertainty to the downside.
You've talked a little bit, Wayne, about you've touched on the qualities that are necessary for the lead or chair director. Can we go back to what you think, in order to build a sort of perfect trusting relationship between the CEO and the chair, what do you think the board should be looking for in terms of qualities for that lead director?
Look, I think a lot of this is contextual, and it matters about where the company may be, but I think there are qualities that transcend. You need someone who is highly collaborative, who has, I would say, both the urgency and the patience to seek the insight from every one of the directors, not just from the loud directors or the energized directors, but to really bring out the insight from diverse perspectives who are on the board. I think you need someone who's got a cool head under pressure, who's going to absorb the bad news and process appropriately, not get highly reactive, because if the chair or the lead is going to be highly reactive to bad news, that's going to send the message to the rest of the board that that's an okay way to perform. So I think those are some of the characteristics. I'll think about my own experience. I'll use Admiral Zortman, who's our chairman today. Probably very few things in life does he not have an opinion about what the right answer would be. But you would never hear him start a conversation with the right answer. Just masterful at drawing out insight from around the table, and then causing the right level of debate to occur, and then coming to a decision, and then banging the gavel appropriately when it was time to bang the gavel, figuratively. And so, he takes the time to bring out the insight, but he never leads with, I'm the chair and here's what, I think the right answer should be. He has just a fascinating way of bringing those board members, along.
And what amount of time would he spend building relations with the level below the CEO?
Well, here's what we did at USAA. So I'll just be very direct about our environment. I talked to the chairman on a scheduled basis every other week, and then I talked to the chairman unscheduled as necessary, probably every week and sometimes more often than that. And we developed a very formal cadence, and then we developed a very informal support cadence around that. And what he cared about was the business, no doubt, our members, our employees, but he also cared about my personal well-being as a human being, as a father, as a husband. And so many of our conversations were not about USA's business, but about what's happening with grandkids or whatever might might be relevant. So I think that is a starting place where there becomes a very fluid, genuine, and deep relationship between the CEO and the chairman. And then our rituals were about every 6 weeks, the chairman and the vice chairman would actually come to headquarters, and we would schedule 2 days of them spending time with frontline teams, technology teams, legal teams, compliance teams, just getting out and about and actually talking to folks who do the work of the work about how things are going. That hygiene that he was willing to do gave him a kind of texture and a real feel for, is what he's hearing in the boardroom like really accurate or not, because he's out talking to folks. And he did that without senior management in the room. We basically sent them out into the wild to talk to the frontline folks. And then what we also did was establish very formal relationships between the C-suite members and the committee chairs, and they built their routines as well, so that there's an ongoing basis of conversation about the business, but at the same time, building a personal relationship with those C-suite members, as well. So those are some of the tactics that we have, done at USAA over the years.
Anything you would add before we go to questions from the floor?
I would just, the word that Wayne used, reactive, is such an important word, because what it signals to the CEO and to the other people of management that happen to be in the room, that you can't surface bad news. And so that's where trust misaligns, and you don't get the information that you need to make the decisions that you want. The way the CEO gets treated is a signal to everybody in the room. And I would also ask, we asked at the beginning, can you remind me, who are the CEOs or former CEOs in the room? Really lonely job, right? Not a whole lot of people that you can go to. So what Wayne was saying, for the CEO to have somebody on the board that knows the four corners of the challenges, not only of the company, but maybe of the travel schedule of the CEO, of what's going on personally, those personal touches, which, for a long time in the US culture, people were just too tough to even think about them. They matter so much. And what you'll find when you have those conversations is that they lead to conversations about hopes, fears, challenges for the business that you may not be able to surface otherwise.
Thank you. All right, we are now going to go to questions from the floor. We have 2 already. And what Jay did not tell you is, if you really want to build a trusting relationship with your CEO, spend 15 hours flying with them to Ethiopia, and you will really have as Jane just did, and you'll have a very strong relationship. So the question here is, how do you leverage a trust relationship, board CEO, to enable a more effective CEO succession discussion process? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll start with that, since we've just gone through that process. I think we have to normalize CEO succession as good hygiene for companies and boards. And it really needs to start the day the CEO starts, not at some later date, because then it becomes just part of the process of the things that we do. And that, to me, transcends into talent management, which is something that everyone can get their arms around, in terms of C-suite leaders and one click below them, where we're actually talking about the people who are running the business today, who have a chance to lead the business tomorrow. But if we build that as a normalized process, and we recognize there's a season for everyone, in these roles, and quite frankly, that season is shrinking. It's not a process that starts today and ends tomorrow. It's one that needs to extend over time. So that's what I would make the argument of, make it regular part of the hygiene of the board and the CEO, and make the CEO's challenge to build his or her bench part of the normal routine. And then CEO succession just becomes another thing we do, as opposed to, gee, maybe Jane, it's time for you to leave, right? So.
I think you're exactly right. And I think if you just relate it to what's going on in the world, we have an enormous problem with CEO succession in our country. Just look at the number of interim CEOs, many of those are board members, so you have to think about that dynamic. How were they on the board before they took the CEO job? Was that always their intention? It gets back to people having different objectives perhaps on the board. We're not doing this as well as we can, and normalizing it is really part of it. Making it understood that part of the CEO and the board's job is to be growing that next CEO. So I think you couldn't have said it better.
And then maybe just one more point for boards, right? We're going to task the CEO with that internal talent process, but boards have to be building a pipeline of potential externals from day one as well.
Yeah, the other statistic that's growing and is alarming is the number of one and done CEOs. So again, really lonely job, really challenging job. 2026 is off to a very challenging start for any number of reasons. The number of CEOs that take their exit packages and disappear is really growing rapidly, and it's alarming because you can look at the external and you can have your folder of CEOs, but they may not be there. They may not want to do it again. So building that relationship, maintaining that relationship becomes even more important. And frankly, having a reputation as a company whose board is supportive of the CEO can be a factor in attracting that next great CEO.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. Building trust is a great focus for boards. How does this trust transcend mutual board trust with CEO to the entire C-suite, as well as cascading down trust to the front line of the business? You touched on that a little bit. Anything you'd
Yeah,
add?
I think I would just maybe anchor a couple of more points, right? Talent management matters so much. The people who are leading these companies, divisions, if you will, or functions, become tomorrow's leaders, but they're actually delivering results today. And I think it's vitally important for board members to have not just a report in the boardroom, but kind of real human interaction with at least one level down in the organization, if not two, because it gives you a sense of the culture of the company. It gives you a sense of the depth and breadth of talent. And back to the point around CEO succession, it gives you a kind of a early warning on what it might look like when it's time. I think it requires a level of trust between the CEO and the board that things are going to be okay if you're talking to my direct reports. And likewise, it requires a level of trust between CEO and C-suite that, I know that if something crazy is going to come from board member A, B, or C today, you're going to let me know about that so we can address it, appropriately, because that could become dysfunctional if you don't have that level of trust and transparency with your C-suite members as well.
Jane, here's a question for you, a little bit cynical. How can a board maintain true independence and challenge management when most directors were appointed under the current CEO?
So it's an interesting question, and I would challenge the premise of it, because I do think that we are coming out of an era where CEOs appointed their boards to an era where boards are appointing their CEOs. And if you look at the statistics, the average board member stays on a U.S. board for 10 or more years. The average CEO has a much shorter tenure. So CEOs are not as instrumental in choosing their board members. I would suspect that changes across any number of boards, but is there the ability to remain independent if the CEO handpicked you? I would argue that if you have the right backing and the right frame and the right understanding of your duty of care, duty of loyalty, it absolutely is. And if you don't have that framework and that understanding and that fiduciary, I should probably say it, NACD can help you with all that education. So a little plug there. But if you don't understand that you are the eyes and ears and voice of the people that are not in the room, and you need to use those eyes and ears and voice for the benefit of those people who aren't in the room, you shouldn't be in the room. And that should be apparent to everybody who serves on a board and everybody who is on a board who views that behavior that is not duty of care, not duty of loyalty, should name it and work through it, because it really is essential to the integrity of the companies, of the public companies, the private companies, and frankly to our whole economic model. So it's a very, very serious question, and I hope that people feel empowered to observe that among their fellow board members and to act upon it if something has gone awry.
Do age limits versus term limits impact the trust factor?
We're not process oriented about that in the US as they are in the UK, where it's 9 years and you're out, or 9 years and you have to write a letter Y, and firm age limits. If you look, it's not so apparent. It's not so apparent these days, but for the 10 years ending a couple of years ago, the predominant proxy vote for shareholders was raising the retirement age. So it went from like 67 to 75, and I guess people thought they could stop then, because it's never really a hard and fast retirement age. It is oftentimes when you hit the age, submit your resignation, and we will determine as a board whether we accept it or not accept it. I do feel there is a link between tenure served on boards and truly independent thinking. And I don't think that link applies equally to everybody. I think it's asymmetrical. I think some people are phenomenal at bringing in that fresh perspective, whether they've been on a board for a year or for 10 years or for more than 10 years. But we do tend to worry about that, and we do tend to perhaps have a bit of complacency about, this person may be getting on in years, they may be less fresh thinking, but we really like them and they're good for the board for all these reasons, and not looking at the frame from the other side, which is, what could somebody new and different bring to this board? So, I think it's always easy to look around the table and say, I like what I got. And that's a good thing. And never say, I wish that person was replaced. I don't know with whom yet, but I bet I could find somebody better. So, I think it's all judgment at the end of the day. And I know that there are a lot of people out there that feel very strongly there should be age limits or term limits. I've seen it work, and I've seen it not work. So I would rather just be pragmatic about it, knowing that we have the power to make decisions as the board and as the Nom-Gov committee, and knowing, by the way, that the ultimate decision is the shareholder vote.
All right.
So just real quick, I would say, back to process and what's in the report, and maybe some things that could be stronger in the report. A rigorous director performance review process and tight alignment between where the company is going and what it needs in governance against who's on the board today, and the courage to refresh the board irrespective of tenure or age is, to me, the right solution. Age and tenure become easy ways to say it's really hard to tell someone to leave the board.
Answer questions in 2 minutes
just
or
one
less,
thing.
because we're going to have a lot of questions now.
Okay, just to say, that's another thing that should be normalized. We should all be looking at ourselves and saying, am I still fit for this board? I know I was 5 years ago. Have circumstances changed?
All right, okay, so two minutes or less so we get to all these questions that just come in. Now I've lost my train here. Founder CEOs, same issue in terms of building trust? Is there a different standard that applies when you have a founder CEO, which is always more complicated?
Well, I think context matters. I think the principles of trust building transcend the context, but you've got to understand the context you're operating in. And every founder is probably different in his or her approach to things and has different levels of stature and structure that they can make decisions around. So I think you've got to understand that context to address appropriately not just the founder, but helping him or her put the right level of diverse perspectives around them as well.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of having this type of talk at Stanford Women on Boards a couple of months ago, which was about the BRC. And it was eye-opening coming from the East Coast, which is very process-oriented, to be in Stanford and to hearing people say, we are the founders, we choose our board, and we tell them what we think we need them to know. Because so there's a geographic aspect to this as well. But I do think the person who asked the question about, CEOs pick their boards, I think that is predominant in the founder landscape. And I think that it does change things for the temperature and the culture of that board, and you should have your eyes wide open. It could be very perfect for you or not, but there is a different tempo, there is a different attitude, and boy, on the West Coast, there's a whole different language about governance.
Here's an interesting question. You've established trust, and then complacency kicks in. Like most relationships, you've got to work at a relationship every day. How do you not let complacency take over what was once a trusting relationship and now just sort of things?
Well, I think that there's an accountability process, again, to be explicit about holding each other to a set of high standards and being explicit about those high standards, because without that, things can drift pretty easily. And then I think in today's world, there are enough catalysts that show up that cause crisis, challenge, or opportunity, that if you are in a complacent place, you're going to feel the downside, of that. But I think one of the best things you can do is have accountability partners on, you said you were going to do X, are you really doing it or not?
Yeah. Keep bringing it up all the time. One CEO I supported used to say, this is a Stephen Covey comment, trust is built in drops and spilled in buckets. Trust often breaks down in a crisis. Can you discuss your thoughts on keys to a good relationship during a crisis?
Yeah, I'll come back to, I've said this before, but the day that you want to meet your neighbor is not the day that your dog climbs over the fence and pulls their laundry down, right? So, being prepared ahead of time, matters a lot. And I think you just have to keep building those relationship behaviors in order to be able to have best intentions expected and then honored when you get to times of crisis. But then I would tell you from a process standpoint, transparency, frequency, good, bad, and the ugly, asking for help we don't have all the answers, are all good kind of behavior tactics that say, yes, we have confidence that we're going to manage through this, but we're not overly confident, and we're willing to take help from the board to work our way through that. I also think that you can create crisis matrices that say, when these types of things are happening, we're going to handle in management till it gets to here. We've got a good monitoring setup, and when they get past that, then we're going to inform you more regularly. And when they get past this stop, then we're going to bring you in to become the decision makers for that. And then looking across at you want to call it the 8 to 10 different cross currents that are floating around, and applying that same escalation to each one of those items sets up a framework, ahead of time.
And sometimes crisis happens. I serve on mining company boards, as was mentioned at the beginning, and we have had fatalities, and the fatalities get communicated to the board by email immediately when the CEO finds out, the board finds out. The responses to that email are really interesting because the whole board has responded, then people respond one by one. And how you frame that response, have we reached out to the families? This is, very sad to hear this. What are we doing? How are we? Or is it, how did this happen? What's going to happen? It really does inform the next few stages of the recovery from the crisis situation. As I said, it is inevitable that something unforeseen happens. How you react to it, how you're mindful of how your words land, whether they're written, how you're facial expressions land, if you're on a video call, all of this is noticed, all of this is taken in, and all of those cues cascade, somebody used the word cascade, down to say, how should we bring up bad information? So it really, really matters.
I think when that's done well, and you brought up a really kind of challenging situation, we'll call it an employee death from whatever source, which we had our share of as well. It actually can strengthen the trust bonds when you manage that type of a process well with empathy and care. Like, it demonstrates the culture of the company and how you show up in an important time.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we send people away today, spend each of you about 2 minutes giving 1 or 2 suggestions of how they should be thinking about their next interaction with either their fellow board members or the CEOs who they work with every day.
Well, we talk a lot at USAA about this is an effort to create Objective X, but in creating Objective X, we also want to improve our capability to do the X's in the future. So we're always looking at getting the job done, but getting better at getting the job done as well, so that your pursuit of excellence better tomorrow than you were yesterday. And I think in a board context, sitting down with your CEO, if you are the chair or the lead independent director, or a committee chair, about how we intend to split the duties between us and them, and I'll use that term very figuratively, and how we're going to operate every day, every month, every quarter together, and then creating an accountability process to then come back and check is really important, because no matter what issue you're dealing with, how we're going to work together becomes the foundation of getting whatever it is done really well in the future.
Yeah. I guess I would, thank you for that. I would challenge everybody here to think of, is there somebody on one of the boards that you serve or management teams that you're on that there is some friction, and you know it, you haven't really named it, you haven't really done anything about it, and reach out to them for a cup of coffee, for a conversation, and see if you can strengthen that trust between that other board member, that other C-suite member, and have that roll up to what we were saying. Trust is individual, and boards are composite beings. I did write, so I'm going to see how this lands, because I had a very, very bumpy flight. So my last remarks are, boards don't control the weather, but we are accountable for whether the company is built to fly through it.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and please join me in thanking Jane and Wayne for their wonderful participation.